Good morning, everybody. I'm glad you're all here. I feel funny coming here before Santa Claus is arriving, but I'm going to. I was told to speak today that they weren't going to cancel it, and I won't be here next week. So I want that clear. If you want to come back, I won't be here next week. There are other things they're offering here, but not my class. Okay, so the place is open, but I'm not going to be here. So I'll be back in 2 weeks, God willing. Okay, I wanted, you're looking in the modern age today, the modern age with the Industrial Revolution and how it's all over the world, and how we are all affected by the Industrial Revolution, and how technology has changed everything from what it was 150 years ago, and from now to going back to 1860. And you say to yourself, are you sure, Mr. Rosenbluth, that the South didn't want factories? They didn't want to mass produce cotton within the South? Why would they go put everything out on a boat to England and have England distribute all their cotton instead of making it themselves? And say, if you look and say 150 years ago with all this technology, but in 1860 and even today, you cannot mass produce cotton with machinery. The best cotton is made by drudgery, hand labor. Today, I went home, took a while to get back to my house. The next day I woke up, I get the Times. And I said to myself as I was driving back in that storm a week ago, no one's going to believe that the South wouldn't want it. I mean, I'm saying it, but did they really believe it? Sure enough, it's like something to confirm what I was saying. An article came in, it was in the Times, and I opened it up, and it's about, I don't know if I'm even pronouncing it right, Uzbekistan. And it is the largest country in Central Asia right now. The largest country in Central Asia, other than China and Russia, obviously, but they extend beyond. But in Central Asia is the largest. It was part of Russia. And what do they do in Uzbekistan? They raise cotton. And where do they get the labor? They get the labor from the cities, from people who are drafted. Doctors, lawyers are drafted for 2 or 3 months. They don't work for 2 or 3 months. They work maybe like 2 weeks, and then they get another group. But 1 million people in Uzbekistan are drafted from the cities, and they get nothing for it. They have to stop the hospitals because the doctors are sent. Into the fields, and from September to November, they are conscripted. They are conscripted, and they're not paid for their time. And this is what it says. Men with scales weigh the sacks, unwrap them to air their contents, the dirty white heaps of cotton piling up on cars, which eventually make their way into the international cotton supply chain. And in June, the State Department ranked Uzbekistan in the lowest category for tolerating human trafficking. Is that, and it also says that they cannot grow the cotton by machinery. They have to grow it by hand because it doesn't have the quality. And yet it is the 5th largest cotton exporter in the world. Yes, ma'am.
You said grow, but don't you mean to harvest it by hand?
Yeah, yeah.
You said grow it by hand.
Well, no, to harvest, they have to pick
Pull
it.
it off by hand.
Right, right. And that to me shows you that the South could have had an economy that was based solely on one product that was making them rich. And this was what was going on. A lousy cotton farmer could make a lot of money. The land was and if you couldn't make it in cotton, you could sell your land and make a lot of money on the selling of the land, because somebody else who was better at it could do it for you, and you still would. So everyone was getting rich. And they decided that they just would not tolerate, because if they had machinery in the South, they would have to take their slaves, put them into cities. Slaves would start to congregate. There would be they were afraid of an uprising. They were afraid that if they took these people off their plantation and put them into cities, that they would start to read, they would start to congregate. And if they got together, there would be a rebellion. Because the whole basis of the slave state was based on the southern black man and woman accepting their fate. And if they were spread out on plantations, and they were given food, and they were given clothing, and they were left there, they thought these black people who were taught not to, laws were passed to teach them not to read, laws were passed that you could not educate them. Because if you educated them, they were afraid that they would rise up and create a revolution. So everything, look how fragile. Remember I said it was a very fragile. The southern state of mind was everything should remain, you can't move it. Because once you start educating people, they're going to walk away. If the blacks started to revolt, like they did in Haiti, or if they did in South Africa, or even recently, the southern way of life would have been destroyed. So they tried to separate, hold down everybody, to keep to make sure that it was not disturbed. It was a situation. I just wanted to show you what the South and the North were going. They were going in opposite directions. The North was inviting Europeans, inviting people to come in who couldn't speak English. The South didn't want anything to do with them. They were very happy with the Scotch-Irish, the Irish. The Irish they could accept because they could speak somewhat English, even though it was difficult. They could figure it out. And if you read about Andrew Jackson, which I have in my next course, he was Scotch-Irish. He was one of those poor Southerners that came, but he was welcomed in the South because his family spoke English. Basically spoke English. He was from Northern Ireland. But in terms of Germans, Poles, French, everybody who did not speak English, there was a movement to invite the Northern people to come in. There was also, by the way, a reaction to that in the North. A lot of people did not like that in the North as well as the South. They even created a party when the Whig Party fell apart called the Know Nothing Party. And the Know Nothing Party was a party, that was the name they called themselves, the Know Nothing Party. And they became very powerful in the 1850s because they resented the foreigner. In certain states, like Indiana and Illinois, and there was a movement to get rid of the immigrant in the North. But, and that is one of the things, believe it or not, that made Lincoln become nominated for president, which I will talk about later, about why they chose Lincoln over Seward. But basically it was because no one really knew where Lincoln stood on immigrants. And the favorite to win the Republican Party was Seward. William Seward, the governor of New York. But what did the governor of New York, William Seward, do that caused him to not, in large part, not get the nomination when he ran for president in 1860. I mean, when he in the Republican Party, he supported the Catholics of New York. He was the governor. He had to make a decision, and the Catholics of New York. Let me get some water. The Catholics of New York. Well, he had indicated that although a majority of the people in New York were against the Catholics, he was going to support them and support parochial schools. Prevented him, you had to get it, you had prevented people in the North. I told you, many of the people in the North were afraid that of the immigrant, and they would vote for a Democrat. They would even vote for a slave, a party that supported a slave person like Douglas over Seward, because Seward supported the Catholics. They needed a man who was not too prominent, not too well known, who didn't take a position on it. And believe it or not, of all the people you would think that would not, it was Abraham Lincoln. He was in the background. He had never been a governor. He didn't ever have to make a decision on that. So I just want you to know that funny things happen. People that we think stand for, but Lincoln never said he was against the immigrant. He just wasn't put in a position to make a decision. Had he been put in a position to make that decision, I'm pretty sure he would have supported Seward. He would have done the same thing Seward did, but he wasn't prominent enough, well known enough, to be the person that would detract the people that were voting for the know-nothing people, the anti-immigrant, and they would probably vote for him if they came from the North, because they really didn't know where he stood. But going back now to the South, in 1860, the nomination looked like it was going to Stephen Douglas in the Democratic Party. Where did Stephen Douglas come from? Did I bring that up?
Illinois.
He came from Illinois. He had done the Lincoln-Douglas debates. He was there was no one but Douglas who looked like he was going to, there was no one really strong enough in the Democratic Party that could oppose Stephen Douglas. He was burdened by one big thing that was not in the Republican Party, but was in the Democratic, aside from the fact that he came from the North and the country was falling apart. The South did not want to support him because he was he had been the one that had created the Kansas-Nebraska Act. He had been the one that said that I don't care whether you vote for slavery, I don't care whether you vote against slavery. So long as the people in the territory, if you're voting for it, have their say, the majority have their say, I'll accept it. Now, that was the position that was taken by the South and the North up till the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And then the South became very, very, in part because of the Dred Scott decision, but large part because of John Brown's raid. They adopted the position different from that. They said, the South did, we have a constitutional right to own slaves in the territories when we go out west. And we're all going out west. We're not stopping Manifest Destiny. The country is moving forward, westward. And new territories are being formed. And besides if the new territories are being formed, we have to have slave states to counterbalance the non-slave states. So we have to extend slavery out there, otherwise we'll be a distinct minority in the country. So we have to, but they took that position that they had now a constitutional right to have slavery, which meant that if a majority of the people in the North, in the territory, voted majority-wise, we don't want to have slaves. And believe it, most of the people in the country were from the North as they were going west. Because the people in the South were making money, why did they have to leave? And they weren't inviting the immigrant, why did they have to leave? They were very happy where they were. But the people that were unhappy were coming in from Germany and whatnot, and they were moving. If they weren't in the cities, they were moving out west. And they were basically wanted land. And they didn't know anything about slaves, and they didn't have the money to buy slaves. You had to have an investment to first buy the slaves. We don't need slaves. Besides, in Germany, there was this attitude. In Germany, in 1848, there was a revolution. And basically, in the revolution in Germany, they said all men are basically equal. And these people were going out west, and they were for freedom. They were against slavery. And the majority of the people, if you had Douglas's position, that the majority prevails, there would be no slavery, because Douglas said, if the people don't want to have slavery, that means the people that want to have slaves have to get rid of them. Got it? Does everybody get what I'm saying? Now the people in the South were saying, hey, wait a minute, we're being outnumbered. The only way we're going to survive is to have a constitutional right in the territory, right? To have slaves, even if the majority says we can't in that territory. We have that right. And Douglas was suddenly the flexible man, flexible Douglas. He was a man of principle, though. He believed in what he said. He said, it's irrelevant. I don't really care about slavery, one way or the other. Now, when he said, I don't care about slavery, but the people have a right to decide it, in 1850, that would have been beautiful, because everybody in the country believed that. But by 1850, things were changing. The South, I told you, was developing a big plantation, less people. They had all this, they were making all this money on the South, and there were not people congregating in the South. So what happened was that Douglas suddenly became a pariah. Where he had been Mr. Popular, he became in the South Mr. Unpopular. Because now he was basically telling the South, you're doomed. You're doomed to lose. Even though he never said that, it meant it. And the people of the South didn't, and they were basically, now in my opinion, they were doomed to lose eventually. Eventually, morality would take over. Eventually, there would be, they would find a way. People could not resist, industrialization. People could not resist scientific agriculture. It would eventually, slavery probably over 100 years later would have died out, even in the South. But no one wanted to accept that. They weren't consulting scientists. They were consulting their money, their pocketbook, and they were making money. And they didn't want anybody telling them that it's basically doomed. Now, who said it was doomed? Even though he didn't say it. I told you Douglas's position would have doomed it eventually, but he didn't say it. Lincoln did when he got nominated to run again, who ran against Douglas in that election. Because Lincoln said, although it's legally right, it's morally wrong for one man to own another man. One woman to be possessed by another man. To have sexual relations with the master. To not teach people to read. It's morally wrong. Morally wrong. But I will not change it. I will not change where it is. It will die its own death. He basically said that. I will not extend it. I will not put it into the new country, because if it's morally wrong, why should I support it? And I stand by what I say. And I refuse to say to you I'm ambivalent, like Douglas says it's ambivalent. Douglas says I don't care if it's there. Lincoln said I do care. It's wrong. Douglas said I don't care. Let the people decide. Lincoln said, don't let the people decide, it's wrong. See the difference? Lincoln basically said, I don't let the people decide, because he knew basically the people would go behind him. Most of the people going out west were against slavery. But he didn't put it in those terms of democracy, that it's all relative, it's all flexible. He basically said there's a constitution, there's basically even though it's legally where it's acceptable in where it is, it's not legally acceptable in new territories. And since it's morally wrong, I will not support it. You see the distinction between Lincoln and Douglas? Lincoln said it's morally wrong. Douglas says, I don't care if it's morally wrong, let the people decide. The South couldn't accept Lincoln, and it couldn't accept Douglas, because the South took a third position. The third position was John Calhoun's, which was adopted, in my opinion, although some people disagree, by Yancey. Yancey's decision, William Lowndes Yancey's theory, that you have a constitutional right to own a slave. You have why? Because a slave is property. And you have a constitutional right to own your property. And the government can't take your property away from you. Is the government taking the northern person's property away from him without paying him? Well, if you can't take the property away from the northerner, why should you take the property away from the southerner? If you take the premise that the southern slave is a property, you're picking on the southern property owner and not picking on the northern property owner. And it's unconstitutional. And Jefferson Davis, who had been in the country, who had been Secretary of State or Secretary of War under Pierce in the 1850s, who had been in power, who was supported Calhoun, who had died at that time, John Calhoun, took that position of Yancey, that in 1860 we have a constitutional right to slavery in the territories that are being extended. Now, none of this going on at this time in 1860, there was no threat to America, within or without America. No one was threatening America. The North wasn't threatening the South. There was no doomsday tomorrow where you had to act. And Douglas got up in the Senate and said, why all this calamity? We've always lived flexibly in this country. The North and the South have always come together. Why are we creating a calamity when there's no one threatening our doors down? When there's no one screaming? Well, unfortunately, there was an election coming up. And every 4 years, a president was being nominated. And if there hadn't been a president being nominated in 1860, right after John Brown's Raid and all this, this wouldn't have happened. But because every 4 years is a president, people now see who's going to be the president. And the president was going to be either Lincoln, it wasn't going to be Buchanan, he was leaving. He said, I had enough of this presidency. Very weak president, but everybody was staying in the Union. No one was threatening secession. The South wasn't going out. Didn't say it was going out. Not openly. Not openly. But in Yancey's mind, in 1860, he said, this is the opportunity. This is my opportunity. And what did he do? Robert Barnwell Rhett of South Carolina was the editor of the Charleston Mercury. And South Carolina had basically said, we've got to get out of the Union. He was the one guy, an editorial, a writer. The editor of a magazine in Charleston, South Carolina says we should all get out of the Union because we are a distinct minority. We are not in this country. We are being picked on. We are in this country formally, but we're really, in our mind, not part of this country. We are a distinct minority, even though it wasn't really they were a distinct minority, but he said they were, it made it look good that we're being picked on, we're a distinct minority. Robert Barnwell Rhett. But he was from South Carolina, and everybody in South Carolina was basically strange to the North. They were all basically, as I said before, one guy said, South Carolina is the one place that is too too small to be a country, but it's too large to be an insane asylum. But it is. And the people of South Carolina felt there was no feeling to the country. They felt that they were picked on for 30, 40 years by Andrew Jackson when they all wanted to leave in the 1830s, which I will talk about in my class on Andrew Jackson. Because Jackson was the first, Andrew Jackson was the, I'm getting off the topic, but I'll just say one thing because I have parts about Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson, if you take my course, had said in 1830, nobody can leave this union. That was 30 years before. And South Carolina had threatened to leave the union, not over slavery, over something else. But Jackson, who was a states' rights man all his life, said, whatever you do, you can't leave this union. And basically what Lincoln said in 1860 was had been adopted. He had got his strength in part, not his moral strength because he was morally against slavery, but he got his practical sense from saying, Andrew Jackson did it, why can't I? So take my course on Andrew Jackson. Anyway, anyway, what I'm trying to basically say, is that there was no calamity. But now Yancey, who was what they called the Prince of the Fire Eaters, he was called the Prince of the Fire Eaters because he had always felt the South was also not part of the Union like that. But he was from Alabama. He wasn't from South Carolina. And he was very, very smooth. He was a fluent, natural speaker. He was not passionate, screaming at people. He had a smile on his face. He had come from, he was born in Georgia, and he was moved up to New York in the 1830s. And there was his stepfather, his father died. He was shipped up north to Troy, New York. His father was a minister, and a minister who was friends with the abolitionists. And his father in his church, his father was a churchman, said slavery is wrong in the 1830s. And the adopted son looked at that and said, I don't know. And then he grew up, he went back south, and he all of a sudden came just the opposite. Came just the opposite of his stepfather. He went back, he became friends with John Calhoun, and what he told the world, because he was in the Congress by that time, he was able to tell the world, he told the world that Calhoun's not going to leave the Union. But what he told about Calhoun, he believed for himself. He said, although John Calhoun, who was the head of the South, is not supporting getting out, I am. But the time will have to come when we have conditions that will permit us to leave the Union. And this time is now. And 25 years later, and he got into Alabama, and he told the Alabama delegation, we're having a presidential election. Are we going to support the only man that seems to have the majority, Stephen Douglas? And he says, no. We're going to hope that we split the party and split the nation. We split the Democratic Party, which always had which the Democratic Party had always believed, since its creation under Jackson and Van Buren, that the South and North could get along together. One, they would always have that's why Buchanan became president, a weak man from Pennsylvania who believed in slavery. He believed that slavery should be left alone. Buchanan was president, a weak man. South and the North were basically split in half. Half the country was basically North, half the country was South. Maybe 40% was 45% was slave from the South, and 55% were from the North. But the South was always, they dominated the Democratic Party. Even though they were about half the Democratic, they dominated the Democratic, because the Northern Democrats always wanted to keep the Southern Democrats happy, to stay in the party and to stay in the Union. So they made concessions like making Buchanan president of the United States, like supporting Pierce and Polk, who were Democrats, in extending out to Texas and making Texas a slave state. Because they wanted to keep the South together with them. Otherwise, they may not have had power. Now, what Douglas had going against him? He had no particular candidate going against them from the North or the South. All they might have had was some favorite sons from each state. Douglas was a shoo-in, it looked like. He had to get, there were 303 votes. See if I 300. They gave me a thing that doesn't work.
No, it's the board.
Just flip it up.
Wow.
Paper, just flip it up.
All right. 303 votes in the Democratic Party. 303. What's half?
151 and a half.
Ordinarily, you would think, right? If you get the majority in a party, you get the nomination. And Douglas had it. He had about 180 votes. And he was assured that it was a majority. But it wasn't a majority because Andrew Jackson, in his eminent wisdom back in 1830, when he was running for president back in he'd become president in 1828. And now he ran for 4 years and was very popular with the country. But he had gotten into a feud with his vice president, Calhoun. And he basically wanted Calhoun out of the party, which I will tell you here because it's germane to this case. And Calhoun was basically out, but he had stopped the front contender who was going to, Andrew Jackson wanted somebody to follow him. He wanted somebody to follow him after he was 64 years old. He was only going to run for president one more time. He knew he was in bad health. And he shouldn't have even run for president then back in 1832. But he wanted to leave a person that he would support to become president after him in 1836. And he said to himself, I have to make this man, since Calhoun is my vice president, I'm getting rid of him, I have to make a new person who is going to be my president, the future president that I will support. In other words, I can't tell, but I want the people to know that I want somebody to become after me, and I want this man, Martin Van Buren, from New York. Now, Martin Van Buren was not by himself basically a very popular man. He didn't have the magnetism of Andrew Jackson. He was from New York. He didn't have the support of the West. So Jackson said, I'm so popular that to make Martin Van Buren look good, I am going to show that my vice presidential candidate that I support to become the vice president in 1832, who will then become president in 1836, because is going to be a man that is not very popular with the people and with the public, Martin Van Buren. How am I going to do that? I'm going to require in these new conventions, instead of a 50% vote in the convention, I'm going to require a 2/3 vote. And then I can convince the people that are against Van Buren that Van Buren got 2/3 of the vote. He only got it through Andrew Jackson's influence, but he got it. In other words, the party was just being formed in 1832, by Martin Van Buren, basically. Martin Van Buren had formed, but Jackson was the engine behind the skills of Martin. There never would have been a Democratic Party without Andrew Jackson doing the motor, Martin Van Buren doing the brains. Martin Van Buren and Jackson got together, and Van Buren had just been rejected by the Senate. Rejected by the Senate for being Minister of England. That's how weak he was. Henry Clay wouldn't let him, it was a 15-15 vote. Henry Clay wouldn't, and I'm sorry, Calhoun wouldn't let him he was going out. He was the vice president, decided that Van Buren can't be Minister of England. It was a 15-15 vote. The vice president had a vote. I'm throwing him out. That made Andrew Jackson so mad at Calhoun and so upset that Van Buren was rejected as Minister of England. They says, I'm making this man President of the United States after I leave. And I'm going to get him the vice presidential nomination. And because Andrew Jackson was such a magnetic personality, he also said, I got to convince the people and I got to get a 2/3 vote in the Democratic nomination. And therefore, in 1832, Martin Van Buren became vice president with a 2/3 vote. And Andrew Jackson could tell the world that Martin Van Buren is the man because 2/3 of these people supported him. Now, believe it or not, the South looked at that later on when they were losing their majority. Remember I told you it was like 45-55? And the South is now less than 50%. They were very happy to now be in a position where if they have a northerner that they don't like with 52%, they could stop it because they had like 45%. And that's what happened because Andrew Jackson decided to make Martin Van Buren vice president of the United States and wanted to show the world that Van Buren had support and he could get 2/3 of the vote. He put that in. It became part of the Democratic Party because the South was very happy with it because they were losing their majority, and now it required a 2/3 vote. And Douglas could not get 2/3 vote, even though he had the majority, because this, what's his name, Yancey, had gotten together in Alabama, and he got together with the people in Arkansas, and he got together with the people in Louisiana, and he got together with the people in Georgia, and he got together with the people in Florida, and he got together with the people in not North Carolina, it's 7 states, 8 states, but Arkansas, Florida, Louisiana, South Carolina, Georgia, Louisiana, I missed
Mississippi.
Mississippi. He got those people quietly, not outwardly, quietly, because he was a manipulator and he could do things behind the scenes and says, let's support South Carolina. South Carolina is doing it openly. Let's do it secretly. South Carolina was saying it was going to leave the Union if a Republican was elected president. None of the people in the South, outside South Carolina, said that. They said, we'll go out, provided South Carolina goes out, but we need to. And Yancey organized the people that were going to this convention. And he got about 1/6 of the convention, about 50 votes from these states, to agree that if Douglas became president, Douglas got the nomination, we'll make sure that a Republican wins. Because we don't want Douglas, because they called it the Douglas Dodge. The Douglas Dodge. Because Douglas now was for popular sovereignty, and what was popular 4 years before became very unpopular in 1860. And Douglas was, everybody said it's going to be Douglas. And it wasn't going to be Douglas because these southern states said, these not the states, not the people of Alabama, not the people of Mississippi. They didn't know about it. They didn't know about it. The convention, Yancey got a group of the leaders and said, look, we don't like Douglas. The only way we can stop Douglas is to walk out of the convention if Douglas is nominated and split the party. But he told some of these people, we're really not going to leave the country. Because some of these people didn't want to leave the country. He says if we stop Douglas, we'll get a compromise candidate. Douglas will have to withdraw. Or the election will go into the House. Because if the South goes out and the North goes out, and we can get a third party to form, which Douglas was not going to leave the Democratic North, and the Southern Democrats would split, that would prevent Lincoln from any Republican. Lincoln had not been nominated yet. Whoever the Republican candidate would not become president and would go into the House of Representatives and the Senate, and we would be able to get a compromise man who isn't Douglas, a Southerner, to become president. So a lot of these people supported Yancey because they felt that they could stop a Republican from becoming president by putting it in the House of Representatives. But Yancey, Rhett, and the diehards really wanted a Republican victory because they were hoping that if the Republican wins, now this distinct minority of 7 or 8 states would be able to leave the Union and form a Southern Confederacy. So they were hoping for a Lincoln victory or a Seward victory. Seward, you know, the nominee hadn't yet been nominated. It looked like Seward was going to become the Republican candidate. So that is what happened in 1860. Douglas had always believed in flexibility. The country was flexible. But these people, and you know, I hate to say this now, but we're talking about now, there are certain people in the Congress that want the whole country to fall down. And that's what it was in 1860. They wanted the whole country to fall down so they could create their own Southern Confederacy. And they wanted this country to fail. And there were 50 or 60 of them in the Democratic Party. And sure enough, they met in Charleston, South Carolina, where the convention was going to be held in April of 1860. April 1860, April 23rd. Democratic Convention's meeting in Charleston. Now, the one city in America where Douglas had no chance, if you took the people of Charleston and put them in the convention. South Carolina, Charleston, a town of 40,000 people in 1860, a town that I said basically stood still. The Southern plantation owners came into, during the Christmas, would come into Charleston and had a home, but they'd go back out to their plantations. Charleston didn't have industry. It had a port on the Ashley and Cooper River, and it was shipping its cotton to all over the world, to England first, and then going all over the world, making their money. But Charleston wanted everything to stand still, and if anyone wanted, and Douglas represented change. Douglas represented the far west. He represented Chicago. He represented the idea of popular sovereignty. He invented the idea of everything is moving. He came from Chicago, where Chicago had 10 years before there were only 30,000 people. Now there's 100,000 people in Chicago. In 10 years, it tripled its population almost. Chicago is where he came from. He was burdened, however, with having a debate with the Lincoln-Douglas debates. And he made statements to get elected as Senator of Illinois in 1858 that bound him in 1860 when he had run against Lincoln for the Senate. And he had said in that statement, you know, basically, he said, you know, popular sovereignty. But he also said, the muscular Northwest will prevail and create the laws of the country. The muscular Northwest. In those days, Illinois was the muscular Northwest. The muscular Northwest will, because he was from Illinois, he made some statements saying how much he's from Illinois, how proud he is from Illinois. And he said the muscular Northwest will state the laws of the country. We are a tolerant people. We are a good, aggressive, muscular people, and we welcome change. You go down to Charleston, that was just the opposite of what they believed in. There should be no change. No muscular Northwest. Douglas Dodge. Why did they call him the Douglas Dodge? Because he didn't say slavery was right, he didn't say slavery was wrong, he said it's up to the people to decide. That's why they called it a Douglas Dodge. Douglas stood for certain principles, but he was basically down the middle. Even though with his principles, he was not compromising, he was down the middle. He believed down the middle. And you would think he'd be an ideal president for a country that was split. But the Southern people didn't want flexibility down the middle. They wanted an extreme left or extreme position. And they wanted a man who said there's a constitutional, and so now it wasn't they wanted to win the election. They wanted to have a convention where words mattered. Words mattered. Do we believe it? In other words, when people are working together, this is a statement of life. When people are working together, words don't matter. Words do not matter if you are working together. You can say anything as long as you're working together. But when you're ready to split the country apart, words matter. Words matter when you are breaking a country up. Words matter when you are splitting down the middle. If you stay together, words don't matter. It didn't make a difference in the North who the Republican candidate would be so long as he got elected, because he basically stood against slavery. They wanted to make sure they won. But in the Democratic Party, it was just the opposite. They didn't want to win. They wanted to split, to lose. I'm talking about the Southern Democrats. So they wanted to break up the party, and words mattered. And Douglas had made the words that slavery is not important to me. I got 5 minutes, so let me know when it's 22.
It's 22.
Does everybody understand what I'm saying?
2 minutes.
Any questions? I got 5 minutes, okay. I got a lot more, but I gotta go because I gotta take a break and I gotta do the next class. I don't want you to think that what I'm saying, I owe a lot to Bruce Catton. I don't know exclusively believe me to Bruce Catton, but I don't want anybody to say, where am I coming from? I don't want anybody to say I'm plagiarizing it, because I'm not. But a lot of my ideas come from Bruce Catton. So please, if you are interested in what I'm saying, read Bruce Catton. He is a terrific writer, and I don't want anybody to say, oh, I want you to at least to give him credit. He's passed away. I want him to give him credit for a lot of the ideas that I believe are, although I've read many other things, I want that to be said. Okay. So long, Michael.
What's your?
I'll see you in 2
Michael,
weeks.
G-E-C-H?
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah. If they